Moving to explicit measures. In this practice, I'm going to show you how you can create explicit measures. Remember that Power Pivot for Excel lets you create implicit and explicit measures, two types of measures. Explicit measures have certain advantages over implicit measures. Specifically, if you decide to deploy your model to SharePoint and make it accessible to other report clients such as Power View and Report Builder, explicit measures are automatically exposed to those clients, so the user can go and actually use the explicit measures, while implicit measures are Excel-only feature. They're only available in Excel pivot reports. And the second major advantage of explicit measures is that you can change their formulas. For example, you can start with a standard aggregation function, but if your requirements change, you can go and change the formula, while implicit measures are read-only. There are several ways to create explicit measures, and we're going to practice them all in this exercise. We're going to start with implementing a basic explicit measure in the Power Pivot window. Let's go and click the Power Pivot window, and let's say that we want to implement a explicit measure that sums the sales amount column. Now, in the previous exercise, we have enabled the Show Implicit Measure feature in the Advanced tab. Let's go and press this button so we can hide the implicit measures and reduce clutter so we don't mix implicit and explicit measure in the same view. Now, with the sales amount column selected, let's go to the Home ribbon in the Power Pivot window and expand the AutoSum button. Now, it's very important not to confuse the AutoSum with the Summarize By button in the Advanced tab. The Summarize By is to specify the default aggregation behavior for implicit measures, while the AutoSum button on the Home tab is for implementing basic explicit measures. As you can see, when you expand it, it has the Power Pivot standard function. In this case, I'm going to use the sum aggregation function. As you can see, when I click the AutoSum button, it creates an explicit measure and it adds that measure to the calculation area. It auto-generates the name of the measure. In this case, is sum of sales amount 3, and after the equal sign, we have the measure formula. And I can change the name of the measure, and I can change also the formula. So, for example, instead of sum of sales amount 3, maybe I want to call this measure sales amount 1, and then press enter. And not only this, but I can right click on the measure in the calculation area and add a description of that measure or change its format. Now, if I use the AutoSum button, the measure automatically picks the format from the base column that is used to create that measure. But if I want, I can go here and specify a different format if I want the measure to be formatted in a different way when I use it on the report. Talking about reports, let's go to Excel and test that measure. Let's refresh the Power Pivot field list. When I expand it, here's my measure. It's added here. It has a special symbol to let me know that this is an explicit measure. So now if I go and add that measure to the Power Pivot field list, as you can see, it produces the same results as the sum of sales amount implicit measure because it uses the same formula. Essentially, it sums the sales amount based on the current context. The second way of creating explicit measures is to use the calculation area. Let's go back to our Power Pivot model. Suppose that we want to create a measure for calculating the distinct count of customers in the internet sales table. So in the internet sales table, we have a customer key. What we want to do is to count the values in that column distinctly. We can do this actually because distinct count is one of the standard aggregation function in Power Pivot. We can do this by just expanding the auto sum button with that column selected and clicking the distinct count. This creates an explicit measure and adds that measure to the calculation area, as we've seen. Now, what makes the calculation area interesting is that it also, you can use this area to test the measure. For example, right now it tells me that the total number of distinct customers across the entire table is 18,484. But then if I want to, for example, to change to filter, let's say only specific dates, then as you can see the formula changes here because it understands that I'm filtering the table, and actually it evaluates the formula only for the filtered subset of data. And of course I can format this measure like what we've seen. For example, I can format it as a whole number with a 1000 separator. So again, the advantages of doing this here in Power Pivot in the Power Pivot window is that when I create reports, formatting settings are going to be applied to the reports automatically. Now, in the book, I'm showing you how you can actually change the formula. For example, I can change the name of the measure to distinct customer count. I can also change the formula. So instead of using the predefined formula, which Power Pivot produces, and that formula uses the distinct count, I can use a custom formula which actually produces the same results. In this case, that formula uses the distinct function to get the distinct values in the customer key column, and then uses the count rows function to count those values. It produces the same results. I'm just showing you that you can actually override the measure formula in the calculation area. And now it's time to test the function, the measure, explicit measure in Excel. Let's go and refresh the Excel report. And if I go and expand the internet sales measure, here is my distinct customer count measure that is being added to the internet sales table. Let's go and take out the existing measures from the values area, and let's click the distinct customer count. As you can see, it shows me number of distinct customers depending on the context. So for example, in year 2005 for Australia, I have 394 customers, distinct customers, who have both bikes. Another way to create an explicit measure is to do this straight from Excel as opposed to using the Power Pivot window. If you click on the Power Pivot ribbon tab, you will see that there is a new measure button. So when you click that button, it allows you to create an explicit measure. As a part of doing so, you gotta specify which table this explicit measure is going to be assigned to. And in my example that I want to show you here, I'm going to implement an explicit measure that calculates a percent of total. Specifically, it's going to calculate the percent of total between the reseller sales amount for each sales territory divided by the overall reseller sales amount across all sales territories. Because it's going to use the reseller sales amount, the table name is going to be reseller sales. The measure name, let's call the measure percent of total. Can specify a description, and then I gotta enter the formula name, which I'm gonna copy and paste. I have a few buttons here that actually help me work with formulas if I'm new to DAX. For example, I can click on insert function to see a list of DAX functions and their syntax, or I can click the check formula to evaluate my formula and make sure that it's syntactically correct. This formula deserves a little bit of explanation. The gist of the formula is the second line, which the nominator is calculates the sum of the reseller sales amount, which is going to be done, of course, going to be evaluated in the sale context. In other words, going to be evaluated for each sales territory. Now, I got to divide this by the overall sales across all sales territories. To do that, I use the calculate function, which takes optional filter argument, and as one of the filter arguments, I use the all function to pin the aggregation, to pin this formula across all sales territories. And then to avoid division by zero, I use the if operator, and I'm checking the denominator, which is this part of the formula, to make sure that if it's zero, essentially the formula returns blank. In other words, again, this is done to prevent division by zero. And finally, the only thing left is to format this measure, because that's going to be a percentage. Let's format it as a percentage with 2 decimal places. And let's click OK. We're in a little pre-release bug, which will require me to refresh the Power Pivot report. But here's our measure, and let's just take the distinct customer account and leave only this measure on the report. As you can see, it calculates the percent of total. For example, the overall sales of Canada, the Canada sales compared to the overall sales are 18% for year 2005, while for United States actually has over 80% contribution. Finally, another way to create an explicit measure is to use the Power Pivot field list. For example, suppose that you want to implement a year-to-date calculation that calculates the year-to-date reseller sales amount. What I can do is to right-click the reseller sales and click Add New Measure, which brings me again to the Measure Settings dialog box. Let's name the new measure Sales Amount Year-to-Date. And for the formula, I'm going to use a DAX function. DAX supports more than 30 time intelligence functions, and one of them is total year to date, which is exactly what I need. It asks me for what column, what expression I want to actually calculate as the first argument, and that's going to be the sum of the sales amount column. And as a second argument, I gotta specify a column of a date type. So you have to have a date table, and in my case the table is called date because date is a kind of a system name, a reserved name in DAX. I gotta use a single quotes to actually enclose the name of the date table. And then I gotta specify a column in that table which is of a date data type, which is the date column. So this is what my function basically, what my formula looks like. Let's go and check the formula, and it appears to be correct. And let's format that as a currency and click OK. Let's take out the percent of total measure. And to understand, to kind of test the, to make sure that the sales amount year to date works the way it should be, we gotta change the report layout a little bit. Let's take out the territory country, and let's move the calendar hierarchy on rows, and let's expand the hierarchy to quarters. And on the report also, let's go and add the sales amount measure as the way the report actually was originally designed. So we can compare the sales amount and the sales amount year to date. Now, for year to date calculations, we expect the sales amount actually to kind of to be a running total of our sales. So for example, let's check if this is the case. For Q3 in year 2005, we have about 2 million, and we have 2 million here. Then we have 4 million in Q4. Now our year to date needs actually to accumulate. So we're adding 4 million with 2 million, that becomes 7 million. So it looks like our formula works just fine for the sales amount year to date.